How much responsibility do you feel that you have, particularly guys, the alt-right, who, as you say, some of them have enjoyed your work, and say,
no,
I'm not one of you guys. I'm not with you guys.
They haven't enjoyed my work.
I've definitely read bits on the internet.
Read more.
You've sold 2 million copies of 12 Rules for Life. You have 800,000 followers on Twitter, 1.4 million followers on YouTube. What is it that you're selling that so many people want to buy?
I don't think I'm selling anything.
Well, I went to a show where you were selling tickets to your show, so people are willing to pay a lot of money to see you speak. You know, what is it that you think that people are hungry for? They want to hear from you.
They're hungry for a discussion of the relationship between responsibility and meaning. And we haven't had that discussion in our culture for 50 years. We've concentrated on rights and privileges and freedom and impulsive pleasure, and those are all useful in their place, but they're shallow, and that's not good, because if people are moored shallowly, then storms wreck them, and storms come along. So I'm talking to people about how they can build a foundation underneath them that works, and people need to know that, because otherwise their lives are harder than they need to be.
What is it that you have that no one else has? What are you offering that no one else is right now?
Well, I think that is what I'm offering. That's not part of the public discussion, and it's grounded in my clinical knowledge. So I've been a clinician for a very long time, and I'm familiar with the works of most of the great 20th century clinicians, and a reasonable amount of philosophy, and a good swath of literature, and I'm a credible scientist, and so I can bring that all together. And I've tried to bring it all together and to make a case for the significance of individual life and the psychological necessity of courage and nobility and responsibility, these things that sound old-fashioned, but are old-fashioned in the best sense. They're old-fashioned because they've lasted forever and they're absolutely necessary. And people need a call to responsibility because they need to mature. They need to want to be adults. And I don't think we do a very good job in our culture of making a case for why it's a good thing to be an adult.
And two things really made you famous, which is, first of all, is the book, 12 Rules for Life. Mm-hmm. The second one, I think, was an interview that went viral with Kathy Newman of Channel 4 News, which you talked about men and women.
Joe Rogan's podcasts help plenty too.
Right, he's got a big following. But that was, I think, really fascinating, that interview, because it was specifically about men and women. And you said at the time, YouTube skews very male and your fan base is very male. Is that still the case? Are you still primarily talking to men?
I would say the talks are probably 60-40, 65-35 male to female. The book sales, I don't know. I doubt it, because usually it's women who buy books, although men do buy nonfiction if they buy books. We don't know the demographics on the books. But the book has definitely expanded my audience, I would say. And that's a good thing as far as I'm concerned. I mean, I never set out specifically to talk to men. My students for most years at university have been primarily female. I think most of my graduate students have been female. It might be about 50-50, but I think it would probably tilt more in the direction of female. So it wasn't something I set out to do. I think, though, that, as I said earlier, well, I can't tell how much of it is merely a consequence of the fact that YouTube skews so male. It might also be something to do with the call to take on voluntary responsibility. I'm not exactly sure why that would be more necessary for men right now. I think it might be because our culture confuses men's desire for achievement and competence with the patriarchal desire for tyrannical power. And that's a big mistake. Those aren't the same thing, even a bit. And it's very inappropriate psychologically and sociologically to confuse them.
Well, one of the things I want to come back to is this idea. So that you say in the book, there is masculine order and feminine chaos.
Mm-hmm. No, actually, I say that those are symbolic representations of the two things.
Right, okay. So why? Why is order masculine?
I think it's because our primary social hierarchy structures are fundamentally masculine.
And that's not the patriarchy?
Well, it's not the modern idea of the patriarchy, that's for sure.
I mean, that's my idea of the patriarchy, which is a system of male dominance of society.
Yeah, but that's not my sense of the patriarchy.
So what's yours?
Well, in what sense is our society male-dominated?
The fact that the vast majority of wealth is owned by men, the vast majority of capital is owned by men. Women do more unpaid labour.
Very tiny proportion of men, and a huge proportion of people who are seriously disaffected are men. Most people in prison are men. Most people who are on the street are men. Most victims of violent crime are men. Most people who commit suicide are men. Most people who die in wars are men. People who do worse in school are men. It's like, where's the dominance here precisely? What you're doing is you're taking a tiny substrata of hyper-successful men and using that to represent the entire structure of Western society. There's nothing about that that's vaguely appropriate.
But I could say equally well that most rape victims are women. You know, terrible things happen to people of both sexes. And
you could say that with perfect utility, but that doesn't provide any evidence for the existence of a male-dominated patriarchy. Well, it just means that terrible things happen to both genders, which they certainly do.
But there are almost no women who rape men, for example. So that is an asymmetry there in sexual violence.
Well, yes, there's an asymmetry in all sorts of places, but that doesn't mean that Western culture is a male-dominated patriarchy. The fact that there are asymmetries has nothing to do with your basic argument.
No, but you might
This is a trope that people just accept. Western society is a male-dominated patriarchy. It's like, no, it's not. That's not true. And even if it has a patriarchal structure to some degree, the fundamental basis of that structure is not power, it's competence. That's why our society works. It's only when a structure degenerates into tyranny that the fundamental relationships between people become dependent on power. It's not power. If you hire a plumber who's likely to be male, it's not because there's roving bands of tyrannical plumbers forcing you to make that choice. And it's the case with almost every interaction that you have at the face of our culture. You're dealing with people who are offering a service of one form or another, who are usually part of the broad middle class, and what you're looking for is the person who can offer the best service, and you can find it. It's not a consequence of being dominated by anything that's tyrannical. And then again, our culture, our Western culture, which is by no means perfect, and certainly has tyrannical elements like all cultures do, is the least tyrannical society that's ever been produced, and certainly the least tyrannical society that exists now. So where's the patriarchy exactly in all of this?
Well, saying that it's the least tyrannical society is not the same as saying it's not a tyrannical society.
That's exactly why I said it was the least tyrannical
But that's
society.
what I mean. So you haven't debunked the existence of patriarchy then. You've said that actually now is better for women.
I don't have to debunk it. You have to demonstrate its existence.
Okay, well, let's go through it. I'm writing a book about feminism in the moment. Until 1919, there were professions that women were barred from. They simply were not allowed to do it. Until 1880s...
Why would you blame men for that?
Because who was in those professions, who was guarding entry to those professions, who was worried about losing their status if women became doctors?
What do you think it was that emancipated women in the 20th century, just out of curiosity?
Well, a couple of different things. I think it was technology. I think it was the pill helped enormously because it gave
when was that developed?
Well, in the 60s.
Right, so that wasn't 1919.
No, but I also think it was a series of legal changes that started in Britain with the Married Women's Property Act, which said for the first time women are full legal beings under the law. They can own property. And that, to me, is a structure that has continued throughout, from a time when women didn't have the same legal rights as men to now when they mostly do, but culture still lags behind it. I don't think you and I are necessarily talking at such cross purposes. It's just that your conception of patriarchy, as I see it in the book, is that quite a lot of men are quite nice and they do nice things for women. And
no, that's not my conception of patriarchy. And I don't require men or advise them to be nice, ever.
Well, you do talk about the guy who's the tampon king, the sanitary towel king of India, right?
I wouldn't call that nice.
Okay,
I would call that brave.
Okay.
Did you read about his life when he was trying to develop that?
Yeah.
God, it was absolutely miserable, and he did it anyways. He freed all sorts of women as a consequence.
And I think that was
nice. That's courageous. That's noble. That's visionary. It's not nice.
I think it is also nice. I think it is also something that is, it is honouring your social obligations.
I'm not so sure that that's a social obligation, because many other people would have done it had it been a social obligation. He said what he was concerned about. He saw that his wife was suffering with her monthly period and had to choose between feeding her family and taking care of herself properly, and chose to feed her family and thought he would do something about that. That goes way past nice, especially given what he had to suffer through to do all the experimentation that produced his eventual technology. So, this whole patriarchy thing, I think you have no idea how pernicious and dangerous it is.
Well, no, I don't. I really don't. Go on.
Throughout history have fundamentally cooperated to push back against the absolute catastrophe of existence. a terrible death rate, the probability of chronic starvation, early death, disease, the difficulty of raising children with all the death that was associated with that, and to look backwards in time and say, well, basically what happened was men took the upper hand and persecuted women in this tyrannical patriarchy. It's absolutely dreadful misreading of history. It's a terrible thing to teach young women, and it's a horrible thing to inflict upon men.
I mean, I absolutely disagree with you. I think that's like saying slavery in the US was actually, most people cooperated. Well, no, you didn't. You had a system where one set of people owned another set of people. And until women got full legal rights, they could own property for themselves, they could work. Essentially, they were owned. They were first owned by their fathers and then by their husbands.
Status to the domination by men.
Yeah.
You already said that you thought that what emancipated women primarily in the 20th century was technological revolution.
No, not primarily, but that's one of two. I think that's two things.
Not primarily, eh?
No,
you don't think the pill was a primary force in the emancipation of women?
I think
or the invention of tampons, let's say, or the provision of proper sanitary facilities, toilets, and that sort of thing. You're thinking instead it was the action of courageous feminists in the 1920s that produced a social revolution that overthrew the patriarchy. That's your theory.
Yeah, I think
that's a foolish theory.
Well, I'm very sorry to hear you say that, but I think, to quote you in the Cathy Newman interview, I think it's a multivariate, right? I think there are lots of different things that all contributed to women gaining equal rights.
Well, then let's not be assuming that Western society was a tyrannical patriarchy.
Well, no, but that's one of them, and then other things happened as well. So you have the pill, you have the dishwasher and white goods, labour-saving devices in the home. I think all of those were really important. But you also have things like campaigns for the vote.
Yes, you also have things like that, yes.
So how, when in a system that existed in England until 1918, when
why would you even want to look at history like that? Like, what's your goal?
Because exactly. I think the people who don't look at history are condemned to repeat it, and I think that what
are we going to do? Repeat the persecution of women? You think that's a realistic possibility?
Yeah, we're sitting here.
How do you see that?
We're sitting here in America, right, where we've just had a 5th judge appointed to the Supreme Court who is now anti-abortion, he's now conservative. I think that abortion rights are absolutely fundamental to women being able to function as full humans in society, and I think that is now under threat in America. I think it is extremely smug and complacent to think civilization has peaked, it's all upwards from here.
Yeah, well, good luck with that, I suppose.
It's a living. Like, there are lots of people who agree with me. There are lots of people clearly who agree with you. There are just a lot of people, I would say, who are coming to listen to what I say because they're sick and tired of having their desire to move forward in the world and to achieve something and to take their place as adult males, let's say, who are under the weight of accusations that their ambition and forthrightness is a manifestation of something that's fundamentally tyrannical. They're not happy with that. It's not doing anyone any good, and it's also not true. It's really a terrible thing to do to young men, and it's happening all the time. That's why they're bailing out of universities like mad. There won't be a man left in the social sciences in 10 years in the universities, and it's no bloody wonder. It's an unhospitable place, and it's unhospitable precisely because of this doctrine. It said that throughout history, the fundamental relationship between men and women was one of power, essentially slavery. It's like, fine, believe it if you want. It's not going to do your relationships any good, I can tell you that. So. Okay, well, we'll see how that one goes. I'm currently married, but I'll raise it with him. I think the universities example is a really fascinating one because you talk in the book about the fact that now women are a majority on 2/3 of college courses in the US. And I've also seen you saying, well, you believe in equality of opportunity, but not equality of outcome. Maybe women...
It isn't only that I don't believe in equality of outcome, I think it's an unbelievably pathological wish and doctrine.
Right,
and it's very dangerous. History has demonstrated exactly how dangerous it is. Equality of opportunity is something that anyone with any sense would support, but equality of outcome, it's...
So what's your problem with there not being...
beyond belief to support equality of outcome.
Okay, so what's your problem with there not being enough men in the social sciences? Perhaps women are just cleverer. Perhaps that's why there are more women at university, right? Under your doctrine. I don't think that, but that's
I think
the logical extension of your doctrine.
It isn't the fact that there's an unequal distribution. The problem I have with it is that the reason that men are bailing out is because of the prevalence of the doctrine that you're espousing. That's the problem I have with it. It doesn't matter that much. They will bail out. I don't see any way that the universities are going to redeem themselves in the next decade. So, and maybe that will be fine, but I doubt it. We'll see.
That seems extremely pessimistic when the numbers of people going to university just generally are going up.
Yeah, well, that's not going to last for very long.
Why not?
Because it's too expensive, and the universities are doing all sorts of things that aren't acceptable, mostly ratcheting up the price. So, and decreasing the quality of what they're offering. And playing into the hands of the people who are ideological acolytes of the identity politics routines and playing postmodern stunts and pushing neo-Marxism and all these things that are characteristic of the social sciences and the humanities primarily.
See, this is where I find you fascinating to me, because you talk in these quite apocalyptic terms. I think that someone will listen to that and think, wow, there's a really big problem. But what we're really talking about is some irritatingly postmodern professors and some students with blue hair and funny ideas about gender in a handful of courses around America and Western Europe. If that's what we were talking
about, no one would have paid attention to me for more than about 15 minutes. So you might see this as some surface manifestation that's irrelevant, but that isn't how most people view it. It's certainly the case, too, that this identity politics battle of ideas was a determining factor in the last American election. If Hillary wouldn't have played identity politics, played cozy with the identity politics type, she would have kept the working class and she would be president now. So these aren't trivial issues by any stretch of the imagination. It's not just some kids having a decent time while they're being creatively rebellious at university. It's a much deeper problem than that. The doctrines that I'm opposed to are predicated on, well, one assumption they're predicated on, it's probably the primary assumption, is that the best way to view history is as the domination of a tyrannical male patriarchy, and that's true also particularly of the West, which is a doctrine I find absolutely unpalatable and historically absurd, biologically ridiculous, and ungrateful, among other things.
Who's ungrateful, sorry, in that? Who is being ungrateful?
Look at what you have.
Right.
You live in the best society that's ever been created. I was reading about some Indonesians.
Do you mean me as a woman or me as a 21st century person in the world?
I mean us, yeah.
I'm incredibly grateful for what I have, but to me the project of politics is
the construction of a tyrannical patriarchy. You're grateful for the productions of a tyrannical patriarchy. How does that make sense?
Because I think life is good. I think it could be better. That's what being
fine.
a progressive means.
That's a perfectly reasonable proposition.
But I guess
that isn't commensurate with your claim that you're the beneficiary of a tyrannical patriarchy.
Why not?
How can it be good if it's the consequence of a tyrannical patriarchy? Tyranny isn't good, is it? I mean, that's the definition of tyranny. Something that isn't good, and yet it's produced all these things that you're grateful for. Like, doesn't that contradiction bother you? Where did what was good come from?
I think I'm benefiting actually from a lot of things that I don't support, that are unearned privileges in my life. I think that's absolutely true.
Like your job?
Like I have a very good job. I had a loving family. Well, I don't think that's going to do the world any good, is it?
That's a hell of a fine rationalization for your privileged position.
Oh, well, fair enough. But if
you could trade it off with someone who's less privileged.
I could.
That'd be a start.
I could do that, but I don't want to, and I won't, and I don't think I should be expected to.
Why not? Is it okay for you to occupy a position of privilege in the patriarchal tyranny? And if it is it because you're female, or is it just because it's convenient?
Well, let me tell you my political philosophy. I guess I'm a social democrat. So what I believe is that you should, if you have a good life, you should try and pass that on. I believe in a progressive redistributive tax system, for example. It was once said by Lord Mandelson in British politics, New Labour was okay with people being filthy rich as long as they paid their taxes. Now, I'm kind of less okay with people being filthy rich.
But define filthy rich.
Well, I think I would leave that
You're probably in the top 1/10% of people who've ever lived on the planet. That would constitute filthy rich by historical standards.
Okay, but I'm not sure that
where is the line exactly?
Be able to help the Neanderthals at this point, really, by giving up some money. But this is my point, is that what I believe is, I believe in a structure in which people who have had a good life and had lots of advantages should pay that back, pay that forwards, which I think is the message that you preach as well, right? You have responsibilities. And if you've had, like us, a lot of advantages in life.
Western civilization as a tyrannical patriarchy.
But it's not purely a tyrannical patriarchy,
That's for sure.
Is it?
It's purely not.
But why would you deal with moral absolutes?
When you describe it as a tyrannical patriarchy, then you make a case that it's purely that. And that's exactly what's ungrateful. It's not purely that at all.
Why is saying that something has elements of this made the same as it is purely that?
That isn't what's being said. Merely to define it as a patriarchy implies unidimensionality. And to insist that that's also tyrannical doesn't offer a balanced viewpoint at all.
Well, I think that's probably where, I think that's probably where your disagreement comes with this, which is because I do not see it in that way. I do not see that as univariate at all. I see it as one element.
Then why call it a patriarchy?
Because it describes an overarching structure.
Does it?
Yeah.
What if the patriarchy is fundamentally composed of women? Is it still a patriarchy?
No, that would be a matriarchy.
Would it? So let's say we take a patriarchal structure, like the medical profession, and we fill it primarily with women. Is it then a matriarchal structure? What makes it a patriarchy to begin with? Is it the hierarchical structure? Is it the fact that it's mostly men? Is it the sociological structure? Or is it the fact that it's mostly men?
Well, I think that's really interesting because male primary school teachers, for example, only 15% of them are men. And I interviewed some of them for my book. And you know what? They report exactly the same things that women do in male-dominated offices, right? They say, people have conversations that I feel excluded from. I feel stigmatized, like I shouldn't be here. People look at me askance when I say I'm a primary school teacher and I'm a man. You know, they kind of reel back. We all make those implicit associations.
So if it is a structure that's dominated by women, then it's also a tyrannical patriarchy.
I think in that case, then men have a way of, they should be able to complain about the fact that a very female-dominated office leaves them feeling out too. Yeah, feeling left out too.
So how do we get something that isn't a tyrannical patriarchy? If it's composed of women, then it's a tyrannical patriarchy, and if it's composed of men, it's a tyrannical patriarchy. We're kind of out of options.
Right, but, well, or you could have an office in which a blend of people of both sexes
work. So if it's 50-50, then it's not a tyrannical patriarchy.
No, not 50-50. I'm saying that people...
40-60.
I'm saying that there is clearly, when it is only 15% of male primary school teachers, they do feel marginalised and excluded. So
you think the defining hallmark of a tyrannical social structure is the predominance of one gender, and if that was relatively equalised, then all of a sudden it would be a free and open institution.
I don't think that male primary school teachers are being tyrannised. I do think they are being marginalised, and I do think that they feel excluded and stressed by that.
So what do you do about that?
Well, this is what I mean. I think actually, and I'm surprised you don't agree with me on this, that actually having more male primary school teachers would be a really good thing, because boys need role models, actually, particularly boys who don't have a father figure in their life. That's really important for them to have a stable adult who shows them what it's like to be a man around the place.
Could be, but you shouldn't achieve it as a consequence of preferential hiring.
No, I don't think it would necessarily need to be preferential hiring. I think it would probably be about making that job, breaking down the stigma to entering that job. I think teaching is a really interesting example. It was seen at the turn of...
I worked in daycares when I was 18, 19.
Right.
You know, there were no men in it.
And how did that make you feel?
I loved it.
Yeah.
You know, the kids, I used to wrestle with the kids, which of course you can't do now because everybody knows that would just be a catastrophe. And I used to draw them pictures of monsters and they'd line up for that. And I liked working with kids quite a lot. And I didn't care whether it was female-dominated. I've been in female-dominated my professions my whole life.
Right, I think...
I felt marginalised as a consequence.
Well, then you have been lucky, and I have talked to people who have
might be luck.
The opposite.
Might be careful conduct as well.
Explain that more to me.
Well, why would you assume that it would be luck?
Well, if I say that, you know, there is a statistical analysis, and I've talked to a broad range of people, and, you know, you would always expect outliers at either end. Some people have had a really terrible time, some people have had a really brilliant time,
yeah, well,
everybody else in the middle.
One of the things that I've strived to do is not to become resentful.
Well, okay, that's very good. I have to say that your Twitter feed does not give me that impression. You come across as somebody who takes criticism very much to heart. Is that true?
I don't think you have any grounds for that suggestion. I mean, you've seen my interviews online. If I was someone who took criticism at heart, I'd be in a lot more trouble than I am now.
In what way?
Well, I've been criticized endlessly for 2 years. I've been in scandals. I've probably been in, I don't know how many scandals in the last 2 years, and had unbelievably contentious interviews with journalists online, on TV, on radio, in podcasts. If I was someone who couldn't tolerate criticism, the evidence for that would already be clear. Twitter's a strange social network. I've kind of pulled myself away from it. So it's not an easy place to conduct yourself with as much grace as you might. And I think it sort of rewards impulsivity because maybe it's because of the constraint on characters or something like that. So I think that people tend to show their worst on Twitter, and some of that's a consequence of the structure of the technology. I think I certainly agree with you. I think that's something that we agree on there. I think people are rarely at their best on Twitter. No, and you know, I pulled myself away from it quite a lot in the last month, mostly to see why. You know, I kind of kept an eye on Twitter, all the social media networks for the last few years, partly to see, well, I'm trying to monitor what's happening around me, I suppose, is probably the right way of thinking about it, and to see if I'm making mistakes and how they might be rectified. But I don't think Twitter's been good for me, and I don't think the reply function on Twitter is useful, and I think the fact that so many people on Twitter are anonymous is not a good thing at all. Do you think you'd be less angry if you went on Twitter? That's something I think quite a lot. I would be come into contact with less things that annoyed me on a daily basis. Oh, I think there's no doubt about that. Yeah, yeah. I think that's definitely the case. And I've talked to other people who've pulled back from Twitter and experienced the same thing. I don't know what it is exactly, but there's something about Twitter that seems to really heighten the desire of people to be provocative. And maybe it's the case that only people who are feeling irritable respond. You know, we don't know, you know, like if you put up a post and 1,000 people read it, certainly 1,000 people don't respond. A few people respond. Well, maybe it skews way over to those people who had a bad day. Like, we have no idea, right? Because it's a communication channel that no one understands. We're not evolved to understand it. We're not evolved to use it. We can't interpret it. Plus, you're interacting with random strangers, which is something you never, ever do. And it's never the same set of random strangers. And you don't react to Twitter like it's random strangers. You react to Twitter like it's a person that you know. And it isn't.
You write in 12 Rules for Life about having had violent impulses that you didn't act on. And I think in Maps of Meaning, you sort of elaborate on that. You say you fantasize about stabbing a classmate in the neck. And you say you're very clear about the fact that you never, ever thought that you would take those seriously. But it just does make me think whether or not, are you somebody who thrives on anger, who finds anger to be something that they need in their life, that they find motivates them to do the things that they need to do?
Those are two different questions.
Okay. You can answer them both.
One is whether I thrive on it, and the answer to that is most certainly not. So I actually don't like conflict.
Then how have you ended up doing this as a job, which is arguing with people, right?
Just because no, that's not my job. It's not to argue with people.
Okay.
So my job is to not do things that I don't think I should do. Right, and my government made the mistake of assuming that compelled speech was acceptable as long as it was motivated by hypothetical compassion. And that's not happened for me. So I made that point. It wasn't because I wanted to or because I enjoyed it. I don't really like conflict. I'm actually a rather agreeable person, which is partly why I'm a clinician. And so I find the constant conflict exhausting. But that's not the issue. You're not morally obligated. You're morally obligated to do things other than that which you like. So now I really do enjoy the lecture series that I'm doing. And the reason for that is that it's not political in its essence. I'm trying to do everything I can to bring people who are trying to develop a vision for their life together and to encourage them to act more responsibly, but not in a finger-wagging sort of way, but because I've come to understand that the meaning that sustains you in life is mostly to be found through responsibility. And through the voluntary adoption of responsibility, you're very likely to find your fundamental strength. And I think that that's clinically unassailable observation. And that's all very good, and I'm very pleased to be doing it. And it seems to be having a salutary effect, as far as I can tell. And but it's not because I thrive on anger. I mean, you were at my show, what, two
on
days
Thursday
ago?
night, yeah.
How much anger was there in that?
Well, I thought it was fascinating because it was in Long Island. We drove to it and we went past a Lamborghini dealership, a Porsche dealership. You know, this is not a poor area. The audience was, I would say, very, as I was surprised how many women there. It was pretty mixed. It was overwhelmingly white. And I thought you talked... you said at the end, this is more incoherent than I normally am. You ranged across quite a range of subjects from, status in monkeys to perception. But the things that the crowd clapped and they applauded where you went, oh, you can't say that, that's a microaggression. Or multiculturalism is a scourge that is sweeping Canada. And what I got was a strong sense...
No, that has swept Canada.
Okay. Well, what I got was a very strong sense of people whose lives...
I never said that it was a scourge that swept Canada either. I wouldn't have said that.
Okay, well, I will go back and check your exact wording of what you said, but you definitely...
I'm not in favour of it as a fundamental doctrine.
Right, okay.
But I don't think it's a scourge.
So I wonder if you and I mean the same thing when we talk about multiculturalism, because you have a First Nations room in your house, right? You have a lot of First Nations stuff. How is the coexistence of...
I'm the honorary member of a First Nations family, as a matter of fact.
Which is wonderful. I have a First Nations artist from when I went to Canada last year. But that, to me, is the essence of Canadian multiculturalism, that culture being preserved and living alongside the Anglophone culture that, in some senses, supplanted it. How is that not multiculturalism?
Well, multiculturalism is the idea that the cultures can all be put together in a single place with no overarching structure or undergirding structures. That's not the case. How can that possibly be the case? That defines the situation in the world. and the world is full of war. So how can that possibly work? If you're going to bring people together and they're going to exist together in harmony, they have to be playing a game that everyone plays, that everyone knows the rules for. It can't be 10 different sets of rules for different people. That isn't going to work. So it's absolutely naive to believe. How, if that worked, the world wouldn't be full of war.
Well, before we had, multiculturalism, we still did have war. In fact, war is, as Steven Pinker, I'm sure you read what Steven Pinker says, this is the least violent time in human history. So
yes,
something
well, that's
is
a consequence
is
of
working.
The patriarchal tyranny.
Well, if you think that the patriarchy's been eroded over the last 100 years, maybe that's what it's down to. Maybe you could give some credit to it for that.
I actually didn't say that the patriarchy had been eroded.
Well, because you don't believe it exists in the first place. Fair enough. But my definition of multiculturalism is citizenship-based, right? So you can be both Canadian and First Nations. You can be both Quebecois and also Canadian.
But that means that everybody in the multicultural milieu is one thing and another.
Right.
But they're all one thing and another.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, our Prime Minister said, well, there is no Canadian identity. It's like, well, okay, what is it that unites us? Well, nothing. We all protect our cultures. It's like, well, that leads to war.
Okay.
Now, it doesn't only lead to war, obviously, but unless you have people operating within a shared framework of perception and value, they can't cooperate and compete peacefully. I don't understand how that's even a disputable topic. That's how you organize people.
Okay, I think if that's what he said, that's what Trudeau said, that is a dumb thing for the Prime Minister of Canada to say when you are Prime Minister of Canada.
You might say that.
Would agree much more with what Barack Obama said when he said, I'm trying not to make a red states America or blue states America or white America, black America. I'm trying to make a United States America. That to me is...
Yes, the Democrats are very good at that.
Well, they
played identity politics for the last 20 years. All they've done is inflame tribal tendencies, as far as I can tell. So he can say that, but it isn't obvious that it's the case. And it's not obvious to me at all that one of the consequences of Barack Obama's presidency was a reduction in racial tension in the United States.
No, I wouldn't agree with that either. I think a lot of people found having a black college-educated professor very alarming and threatening to their idea of themselves as the dominant group.
To stop them from voting for him twice.
No, that is very true, but again...
It's fundamentally true, right? It's really the crucial issue at hand here.
No, but he built a big coalition of white, well-educated liberals and people of colour. I mean, that is the Democrat electoral...
Well, how do you explain the rise of racial tension in the United States, then?
Well, I think it's caused by a lot of things, not least of one of which is the Republican Party inflaming it. You talk about the left playing identity politics. I think the right play identity politics all the time.
The right doesn't dominate the universities.
No, but it dominates... But Donald Trump is president, so realistically...
Donald Trump is hardly a typical Republican.
No, I would say that he accomplished...
In fact, for most of his life, if I remember correctly, he was a Democrat.
Right, I don't think he has any political...
So we're not going to blame Donald Trump on the right wing.
Okay, but I'm going to say the rest of the Republican Party are also quite happy to play, I would say, white identity politics. They did not dump him as their candidate when he said, Mexicans, they're not sending us their best people here, they're rapists, right? The whole idea of the United States, it said, I think a beautiful thing, all men are created equal, but it meant men, and it meant specifically white men. Women and black people could not vote. The US was founded on identity politics. This is not some new concept that has come along in the last 20 years.
The United States wasn't founded on identity politics.
Yes, it was.
That's absolutely absurd proposition. The United States was founded on the same principles that, what would you say, that played their powerful role through the development of English democracy. And that was nested inside a Judeo-Christian view that fundamentally presumed that both men and women were made in the image of God and that all people had divine value. And it took a long time for that set of ideas to fully manifest itself in the political realm. But to consider that a manifestation of identity politics is, I can't imagine why you would possibly do that.
I don't consider that a manifestation of identity politics. I consider having a constitution that says only some people are citizens to be a manifestation of identity politics.
Well, what do you think changed it across time? And look, let's get our definitions straight here. You can't lump all occurrences of non-equal treatment into the category of identity politics. Identity politics is a very specific thing. It's really only existed since the 1970s. You can't go back into 1770 and say that the founders of the American Constitution were playing identity politics.
They were playing politics that was based on identity. That's my definition of identity politics.
That's not the definition of identity politics unless you play fast and loose with the definition. identity politics is something that's... No one talked about identity politics 20 years ago or 30 years ago. It's a new term. You can't say that people's proclivity to identify with their group is identity politics. That's just tribalism. And that's like, who knows how old that is? 1,000,000 years old. 500,000 years old. And you're going to call tribalism identity politics? Well, that's not helpful. If you want to talk about tribalism, we could talk about tribalism. But identity politics is something that's nested inside a particular political view of the world. It's got a Marxist basis, and it manifests itself in postmodernism. And it emerged in the France first in the 1970s, and then has swept through the American universities and increasingly the rest of the West since then. That's identity politics. If you want to talk about tribalism, that's fine. I'm not a fan of tribalism, which is why I don't like the identity politics types. And I don't care if they're on the right or the left. I think the right-wing use of identity as the primary marker for human categorization is as reprehensible and dangerous as it is on the left. My problem with the left at the moment, the fundamental problem with the radical left, is that they're hyper-dominant in academia. And that's not good. And that's not my opinion. You can go look at Jonathan Haidt's data and see for yourself. And he's as moderate a person as you could hope to find, and probably less prone to anger than me.
And I agree with you. I find a lot of students phenomenally irritating, but I would question how much power they have in contrast to the things that I find more worrying that are happening in the world today, right? Or even the professors, right? Even the professors.
20-year-olds don't have that much power, but they're not 20 forever. 10 years later, they're 30. And 20 years later, they're 40.
Right.
And whatever happens in the university happens everywhere 5 years later.
And very, very sadly for people in my politics, left-wing politics, what happens to people as they get older is that they've traditionally got more conservative. Mm-hmm. So I don't think you can make a case that the current, where people are when they're 20 today is actually going to be the ideology that takes them all the way through their life. That's never been the case so far.
No, but it'll be around long enough to do plenty of damage, like it already is.
Okay, but even if we accept that students and their POMO professors are quite annoying, which I think is probably something I agree with.
They're not just annoying. Like, they're destroying the universities, and that's not a good thing. And they're particularly destroying the social sciences and the humanities. The sciences are safe so far, but not for long, because the scientists in particular are terrible at politics, and the left-wing activists are great at politics. And so they'll win eventually. The National Science Foundation is already introducing diversity requirements for hiring in mathematics in universities. It's like, good luck with that. That's not going to work. There are hardly any mathematical geniuses. If you start putting all sorts of arbitrary restrictions on their hiring, you're just going to end up not finding the ones that there are. So, besides,
I don't think that's true, actually, because if you say there are very few mathematical
geniuses. What do you know about it?
Well, next year I'm going to be a fellow at Oxford University, so I spend time talking to academics. I've talked to a lot of academics for my book. I do agree with you, there is an illiberal strain that is sweeping through a lot of universities. I don't think it's an existential threat, and I certainly don't think it is, to me, the biggest issue in world politics today. It's the one that I would choose personally.
What do you think is the biggest issue? I
think that the rise of strongmen, authoritarians around the world is very worrying, and that's one of the reasons that I find the subtitle of your book fascinating, because it's called An Antidote to Chaos. Why isn't it an antidote to order, which you also say in its excessive manifestations is bad?
I've said that. Well, you can't write a book about everything.
No, but you've specifically chosen Antidote to Chaos. So why is chaos the big...
I also have 300 lectures online, and I talk plenty about the pathology of order in those lectures.
Okay, but
so
I'm just saying...
I'm no fan of authoritarian strongmen, that's for sure.
Well, that's good, but I do think that the way that you talk about order in the book is something that people will take away from it.
Be specific.
Okay, so let me think. The way that you talk about natural dominance hierarchies in lobsters. Let's get on to the lobsters. Because I think that the thing that people take away from that is male lobsters compete for female lobsters, and that says something about society now, that men need to be dominant in society. Because if lobsters do it, then there is something that we can read about humans from that too.
There's nothing in that chapter at all that suggests that the way that men should succeed in human hierarchies is a consequence of the exercise of power. There's not one line in that entire book that claims that, because it's not what I believe. Most human hierarchies, as I already pointed out, are hierarchies of competence, not power.
Okay, so
that's why we don't live in a patriarchal tyranny. And so if you want to be a successful man, then you should be competent, and that will move you up the hierarchy, and that will make you attractive, and for good reason, unless you want an incompetent mate, which is possible and happens, but isn't something that I would recommend. People will sometimes choose an incompetent mate because they're intimidated by competence, and so they'll settle for someone who they don't respect because they feel that they can master them and they won't be intimidated. But it's not a recipe for a happy life, I can tell you that. So there isn't a line in that chapter that talks about power as the proper means of conducting yourself in life. There's not a line in the book, and there's nothing in anything I've ever said that suggests that.
Okay, no,
but it's really important because people have read this chapter and they make exactly the argument that you make. And it's a misapprehension. So it's a misapprehension of the book.
Okay, but if so many people are getting the same misapprehension, could it be possible?
There aren't so many people that are getting it. There's 2 million people that have bought the book, and there's a very small handful of people who have a particular ideological perspective who enjoy developing that perspective because it indicates just what sort of reprehensible individual I am. But it has absolutely nothing to do with what I wrote or what I've said or what I believe. I don't believe that our fundamental hierarchies are based on power. I don't believe that the way that you move up our hierarchies is as a consequence of manifesting power. It's competence.
Okay. My big problem with the lobsters is that it's scientifically bollocks, right? It's just you cannot read across from lobsters and what they do to what humans do.
Of course you can. That's why serotonin works on lobsters.
But it works in 2 different ways. So serotonin makes lobsters more aggressive. It makes humans less aggressive. Right? That's what happens.
That's not right. Serotonin makes human beings more dominant but less aggressive. And the only reason it makes them more dominant is because they're less irritable and they're less defensively aggressive. So it's not bollocks. I know my neurochemistry. So if you're going to play neurochemistry, let's go and do it.
Okay, well you say antidepressants work on lobsters.
Yes, they do. They make a lobster that's been defeated in a fight more likely to fight again.
That's not the same mechanism that happens in humans.
Yes,
because lobsters don't get depressed as the way that humans are. I think you're anthropomorphizing into a ridiculous degree. These are creatures that urinate out of their faces.
I think that the fundamental issue among knowledgeable animal behaviorists is that anthropomorphization with animals is generally the appropriate tactic unless you have reason to doubt it, which is because there's continuity between us and animals rather than discontinuity. And the idea that the anthropomorphization of animals is inappropriate is something derived from 1950s behaviorism. The highly trained affective neuroscientists and people who study motivation and emotion as well as neurochemistry know perfectly well that there is biological and behavioral continuity across the animal kingdom and way down into the kingdom as well, which is exactly why I chose lobsters, to indicate that there is so much continuity in the systems that allow us to estimate status position that we share it with creatures that are 1/3 of a billion years old. And the reason that I made that argument was to put paid at least in part to the absurd Marxist proposition that hierarchical structures are a secondary consequence of Western civilization and free market economies, which is as preposterous a perspective as you could possibly develop about anything. Hierarchies are 1/3 of a billion years old. You can't blame them on the West or men or capitalism. And we're wired for hierarchical perception in ways that you can hardly possibly imagine. Even our ability to rank order a set of objects seems to be tightly linked to our ability to assess the relative status of people in our social milieus. So, and the biochemistry is very, very similar, and the reason we know that is because most of the drugs that are used on people are first tested on animals. Now, it's not often animals as primitive as lobsters, but it is plenty. So a lot of what we know about neurological structure, for example, is a consequence of studying the flatworm, which is a much more primitive organism than the lobster. Continuity is the rule.
Okay, so what can we learn from killer whales that live in matriarchal pods, often led by a grandmother, someone who's been through a menopause? Why isn't that an example that you've picked to talk about in the book? It's because lobsters say the thing that ideologically you want to talk about, which is your belief that there is a kind of Marxist ideology sweeping.
How do lobsters say that? The point that I was making with lobsters, I just said what it was. That hierarchies have been around for a very long time.
But who genuinely, really, today is arguing, apart from maybe 3 mad Marxist academics, that there is no such thing as hierarchy? Hierarchies
They're not arguing that there's no such thing as hierarchy.
Or there should be no such thing as hierarchies.
Oh, there plenty of them are arguing that.
Really? Because I see that almost never in the wild as an argument. I see people think that hierarchy should be based on merit and they should be more equal.
What do you think the demand for equality of outcome is if it's not an attempt to flatten hierarchies or to eliminate them? What else could it possibly be? And you don't think the neo-Marxists and the postmodernists think that hierarchy is a social construction? Like, you're not talking about the same people that I know, right. That's for sure. Everything's a social construction for the social constructionists, including hierarchies.
But I just don't think that is a very widely held view in the world. It might be among liberal arts universities.
20% of social scientists identify as Marxist.
Where's that statistic from?
Look it up in Haidt's work.
Okay.
You-
I know. I mean, I'm interested. I know.
I've checked it out quite carefully.
Yeah, but
It's a perfectly valid statistic. I don't have the reference at hand.
Yeah.
So it's 1 in 5. Okay, and the number of conservatives, or even liberals for that matter, in the social sciences and humanities is not only vanishingly small, but getting smaller. And you think the social constructionists believe that hierarchy is built into biology? They're not very good social constructionists if that's what they believe. And the postmodernists and the neo-Marxists are radical social constructionists because they wouldn't believe that human beings are infinitely malleable and that we can be recreated in whatever image the ideologues might want to recreate us in if they didn't think that. And it's much more prevalent than you're admitting. I mean, there isn't a competing position on campuses except among the evolutionary biologists and the evolutionary psychologists, let's say, and they're under complete attack. They're certainly next on the chopping block as far as I can tell. I've been warning them for the last 2 years. Social constructionists don't like evolutionary psychologists and they don't like biology. And I really don't understand why, except that it interferes with this idea that human beings are infinitely malleable and stops them from being able to blame hierarchy on the West. Look, if you're really concerned about the poor, as a social democrat, let's say, the first thing you should do is abandon your presupposition that the dispossession produced by hierarchies is a consequence of the patriarchal structure of the West. It's a way deeper problem than that. So there have been people who've been dispossessed forever, way before capitalism.
Okay, I think I would agree with that. So if it is a way deeper problem than that, how do you tackle it?
I don't know.
Well, that's a bit... I mean, that, for someone as intelligent as you that just throw their hands up and go, ooh, maybe some people
There's lots of things I don't know how to tackle. I don't know how to tackle the fact that people range extremely widely in their cognitive ability either. These are big problems.
Right, but we could start with a redistributive tax policy, right, where people who earn a lot pay more tax than people lower down the income scale to redistribute income. That was a fairly obvious way that you could make poor people less poor. It's something that, the Labour government did. They almost... I think they halved child poverty. It is possible to do things, and we do have mechanisms.
Well, I wouldn't make the immediate presumption that it was the redistributive tax policy that halved child poverty. You know that absolute poverty in the world has halved between the year 2000 and 2012, and you can't attribute that to redistributive policies.
No, I can't. I'm only talking about Britain. I'm talking about that particular government, which had, then there are fiscal analyses that have been done. But I think let's move on from lobsters. I mean,
That chapter is about people becoming responsible and competent, not about them becoming like dominant and powerful.
Okay,
it's not that at all.
But my problem with it is I think you got criticised by a lot of marine biologists, right, and by a lot of geneticists.
I think
for
one.
Okay, well, I can name it. P.Z. Myers is one who's criticised you. Adam Rutherford, who's former editor of Nature, has criticised that chapter. There are, that is not... But what I think is fascinating is that...
No reasonable biologists dispute the fact that most organisms organize themselves into hierarchies, and that the fundamental biological mechanism for the regulation of hierarchy is the serotonin system. That's not disputable. Now, you can find animal organizational structures that vary from that, what would you call it, fundamental pattern. But the existence of variance isn't proof against the existence of a fundamental pattern. Like, I don't know how you can sit there and be skeptical about this. If you know the literature on hierarchical structure, you understand that across the entire animal kingdom, animals tend to organize themselves into hierarchies. And that the neurochemistry
but very
of the hierarchy
different
is
types of hierarchies, right? So
well, there's a pattern. That's why we know they're hierarchies.
Right. Yeah, but like you say, the pattern as if that the
hierarchy is the pattern.
Right. Okay, and that's fine. So chimps have one very obvious social structure, and bonobos have another.
It's not
one.
as different as people have made it out to be. No. The bonobos are a lot more violent than the
and they're not hippie monkeys, right?
Observers of the bonobos have admitted.
Okay, but nonetheless, you say that as if those little details don't matter, as if there can't be such a thing as a hierarchy that is much worse than another hierarchy. That's my problem with it.
I'm not saying that at all. There's clearly hierarchies that are worse than other hierarchies.
Right.
Baboons have terrible hierarchies, for example. And tyrannical hierarchies aren't my cup of tea. Right. That isn't the point I was making. No. The point I was making was that hierarchies can't be blamed on capitalism or the West. They're built into our biology. The neurochemistry is so old that we share it with crustaceans, so that's 1/3 of a billion years, which is the proof that hierarchies aren't a recent construct. If proof like that needs to be provided, and that the best way for people to adopt a strategy that will move them up the hierarchy, which is a desirable thing in most regards, is to face the suffering of the world forthrightly. That's what that chapter is about. And the people who've been criticizing it read it as if it's a defense of the Western patriarchy. It's like there's no defense of the Western patriarchy.
No, I don't think that's true. I think the way that people criticize it is and I think this happens a lot with evolutionary psychology, is which is not quite what the lobsters are, but is where other stuff in the book is. Other things you said, for example, like women wear rouge because it reminds men of ripe fruit. Right. Well, for a start,
why do you think women wear rouge?
I have absolutely no idea, but
right,
I will tell you.
That's really not a very good answer.
Well, yeah, you said before there were lots of things you don't know the answer to, but I'll tell you one thing.
I'm not criticizing your perspective on this. You're criticizing mine, so I'm presuming you have an alternative idea. Why do you think women wear makeup? Why do you think there are an enormous number?
But let's go back to why women wear rouge, because it reminds men of ripe fruit. Okay, first of all, not all ripe fruit is red. Why would you want to...
we evolved color vision to detect ripe fruit.
Do you want to eat women? No. I think unless men are having sex with ripe fruit...
You might want to taste them.
That's not really where... And where is the evidence that women who are redder in the cheeks have more offspring?
What do you think happens during the sexual flush?
But that's the key point, isn't it? Is that you would expect, actually, if this is a sexual selection, that women who are redder would have more children. We would get progressively redder over time.
One of the hallmarks of youthful skin is the proclivity for it to flush red. And yes, youthful women have more children. It's a primary sign of fertility.
I think you're using...
Wait a second here. What do you think women wear makeup for? Come on, if you're going to go after me on this,
okay.
Let's women. People say, well, women wear makeup to feel better about themselves. It's not a very deep analysis. Why makeup? Why facial makeup?
I'll tell you why I wear makeup, which is to stop the comments that I would get if I didn't wear makeup. And my gender, I always say my gender is low maintenance, right? I don't feel particularly like a woman inside. I don't really know what that would mean. But what I try and do is try and look, you know, in the same way that you get black women who talk about the problem with natural hair, is it's seen as unprofessional, right? And as a woman, if you don't wear makeup, that is seen as a political choice. That is seen as something that, you know, you are...
So you wear makeup to protect yourself from what? From tyrannical men?
No, but and tyrannical women as well, I would say. I think women very harshly judge each other's appearance, and there are very good reasons for that.
It's probably because they've learned that from oppressive men.
No, I don't think so.
Why do you think it is, then?
I think that women are encouraged to be seen as being in competition with each other.
Encouraged? You don't think that there's anything about that that's natural, eh?
Well, I would be reluctant to get into that, because I think you could talk about intrasexual competition. I think that's a very big deal among the social sciences and evolutionary science. It's not my particular competence. But yeah, my conception of the patriarchy is not that men are beastly to women. It is that there is a structure in which women participate too that overall privileges and benefits men in order to control female reproduction. And I think those are two very different things. You write in 12 Rules that you skipped a grade in school and you were small for your age. Do you think that shaped your personality and your experiences of life?
I did, to some degree. Made it difficult for me to participate in sports. So I didn't really do anything that was fundamentally athletic till I was in graduate school. So my parents are guilty about that because they felt that it wasn't good for me, but I'm not unhappy about it. I got through school faster. I wasn't a fan of school, and the faster I got through it, the better. I think it might have encouraged me to do two other things, which was I probably hung around with rougher kids that I might have otherwise, partly as a compensation, I suppose, for being smart and academically able and also small. So I probably exaggerated my roughness, I suppose, and it made me more capable of verbally defending myself. But other than that, I don't think it had much of an effect. I think I pretty much left all of that behind.
That's very good. Also, the other thing I was really interested to read was that you married your teenage sweetheart.
Yeah, well, I met her when I was 8. So we've known each other for 50 years, yeah.
So this is, I think, really fascinating. So I read that and I thought that was quite moving. And then I was reading the bit about, you know, the animal kingdom, and the bit for you take away from the lobster section is that, you know, what happens if you're top lobster is that you get to impregnate all the females. So that's as being evolutionarily successful as a lobster, right?
That's proclivity towards polygamy, which is one of the things that pulls on human society. Right,
and you're now the pretty big lobster, and yet you are monogamous. You're faithful to your wife. You don't want to go around impregnating every woman that you see, right?
No, no, one woman's enough trouble.
Right. So I think that's to me that was really interesting, because that's a way in which we are very obviously very different from animal society, and to me
Well,
it
we're
takes
not that different. I mean, there are plenty of societies where exactly that happens.
right. But
So-
you've been able to overcome that biological urge, right? And so in the sense that maybe there are other biological urges, such as men's propensity towards violence, that might also be overcome.
Well, it's not self-evident that you want it to be overcome. I mean, you don't know what goes along with it. You know, I mean, obviously, first of all, defining violence isn't that straightforward. How about use of force in self-defense? Does that constitute violence?
I think to me that's a separate category of violence. I think
Well,
self-defense.
but it's not that easy to distinguish
Right.
them. Like if you're, what you want to do with a child who's aggressive is socialize them so that they become sophisticated in their manifestation of their aggression. You don't want to inhibit it. You certainly don't want to socialize little boys to be more like little girls. That's, first of all, you don't know how to do it to begin with. But second of all, it's not very, it's not an advisable strategy. So.
Well, I found that really interesting, because in the book you say that actually if you feminize men, that might give them more of a, might have more of an allure towards, these very fascistic ideologies.
Oh, there's no doubt about that. That's standard psychoanalytic. That's like psychoanalysis 101. If you repress something, it comes back with a vengeance.
Okay, so tell me what you mean by feminizing in that sense. Because to me, if you don't mind me saying so, you are a man who is quite feminine. You're in touch with your feminine side. You are very well dressed. You talk a lot about your diet. You've talked about your emotions.
I hate talking about my diet.
Right, but you cry in public. You enjoy spending time with your kids. All of these things that are not
sad, isn't it?
But they're not stereotypically male, and I think that's very admirable.
Pretty strange behavior for a patriarchal tyrant.
Well, that's why I think that you're probably, in some ways, you're not a patriarchal tyrant, or that actually all of our programming, if you want to call it that in biology, is overcomable, because you are...
It's integratable.
Right, but you are a man who some people would say has a lot of feminine traits like that, and I don't... Do you think that means that you are now being in the allure of authoritarian fascistic ideologies because you're baking cakes?
Oh, I notice the allure.
And then what do you do with that?
Work to live such that there's no temptation in that, which is also what I recommend to everyone else.
Right.
If you see any temptation in that, then you should straighten yourself up real quick. So, and that's what I've done for decades. So of course you have to see the allure in that. If you don't see the allure in it, you're a fool. Just like if you don't see the allure in the radical leftist ideas. I mean, if they didn't have, if you didn't understand the allure, you couldn't understand the ideas. They're dangerously alluring. It'd be lovely if there was a strong man who could solve all our problems, and those who deserved it got exactly what was coming to them. It's not something that I would recommend as a wish. So, but that doesn't mean you want to be blind to its attraction. You want to see what the dark parts of you are attracted to. It helps you keep an eye on where things can go if they go badly sideways. So, I don't think it has anything to do, though, with my what would you say, more classically feminine interests. Not as far as I can tell. I mean, I have all sorts of classically masculine interests too, so
right, and
it seems to be reasonably well balanced.
Right, so you talk then about we shouldn't socialise little boys like little girls, but actually, I have lots of stereotypes. I'm interested in politics, which is overwhelmingly male-dominated. You have lots of classically feminine interests. Why, what is the problem here with people having personalities that are a mixture?
There's no problem with that at all. The problem is when it's dictated by fiat.
Well, I mean, who's fiat?
How about the education system?
So in schools, you think that there is that?
Well, I outlined. I can't remember the psychologist's name at the moment, but he was quite influential in the 1980s, who recommended as a control for male violence that boys be socialized more like little girls. And I don't think that that's a particularly unpopular viewpoint. So on the de-emphasis on competition, for example, in games, the increase in the rise of competitive games where scores aren't kept, that sort of thing, is all a manifestation of that kind of theory as far as I'm concerned. The idea that there's something intrinsically wrong with competition. It's a very foolish idea, especially if you want to motivate relatively aggressive boys, because they're competitive. Well, competition, that's not good. Someone has to lose. It's like, well, you're not going to get very far looking at the world that way, I'm afraid. Maybe you want to generate a plethora of games so that everybody has a shot at winning. That's a good idea, but you certainly don't want to devalue the notion of winning. If you're doing something necessary, you should reward people who are particularly good at it. It's part of the definition of it being necessary. So, and you don't want to control aggression any more than you want to control sex. You want to integrate it. And if it's integrated, that's the integration of the shadow from the Jungian perspective, and something I talk a lot about in my lectures. It's like you need to have the capacity for danger. You need to be dangerous, but you need to learn how to not use it except when it's necessary. And that is not the same as being harmless. Harmless, that's a terrible virtue. It's like a rabbit. There's nothing virtuous about harmlessness. It just means you're ineffectual.
Yeah, I think I would agree. Well, I think there are some people who through their harmlessness become iconic and they become symbols. I think the Gandhian principle of non-violence.
He's not harmless. He just transcended his deep violence. That is a completely different thing.
Okay.
Without that capacity, there would have been no way he would have had the strength of character that he had. He was an integrated person, not a harmless person.
Okay.
That's a very, very different thing.
Did you have different ambitions for your daughter and for your son?
Some of them were different. I encouraged my daughter in her desire to be a mother, which is not something I did with my son.
Did you encourage him in his desire to be a father?
Absolutely.
Right. So you encourage both of them to be a parent.
Right, but those are different.
Yeah.
I
believe.
and yeah, I mean, and in some sense, I think it's harder for young women because, of course, the problem of integrating family with career is a more complex problem for women to solve. So, and I spent a lot of time talking to her about how she might solve that. I wouldn't say that we came up with anything that was spectacularly original or successful, but I at least let her know that whatever pathway she chose was fine with me as long as she was being honest with herself about what it was that she wanted. But also that, I'm not a fan of the idea that the most fundamental orientation that a person is likely to have in their life is career. I don't believe that's true for most people. I certainly don't believe it's true for most women. And I think the evidence supports that claim quite straightforwardly. So,
however, it is the only thing that you get paid for under capitalism. Right?
Man, live.
But that's
How can
true.
you say something like that? It's so cliched.
Well,
it's so painful to hear that.
It may be cliche, but it nonetheless is true, right?
Look,
Women do
it's
more,
not
much
capitalism.
more. Well,
for God's sake.
It is.
No, it isn't. You have to invest into a child for 18 years before they have any economic utility. Mm-hmm. It's a consequence of delayed economic utility. We don't know how to monetize it. It's not a consequence of capitalism. It's a consequence of the fact that human beings have an 18-year dependency. How do you monetize that, even in principle? Well, we don't know.
We did used to send them up chimneys, to be fair. And at that point,
what's
really interesting is at that point, children were seen as being much more the property of the man. I mean, as they become economically useless, all the legal studies show that that's when we start moving to a model of female custody, right? Because it was about caring labour. But this is the point I'm making. Is
Look, I'll tell you, there are plenty of men who are not very happy about the model of female custody. And that would, include the 85% of men who are essentially denied 50-50 custody when they divorce and have young children. So I wouldn't think that one of our major problems, or at least a major unidimensional problem, is the proclivity of men to foist off the custody of their children onto women. There's certainly another side of that argument.
There is, and I do think that actually a lot of anger has been generated by the way we have in Britain anyway, or England and Wales, we have an adversarial fault-based divorce system, and that's something that's changing. But what it does is encourage people to come in on day one and say, if you want to get divorced, you're going to have to make out a case that the other person has been a bastard.
It doesn't matter, because if you move to a non-fault-based divorce system, then all that happens is the fault shifts to who should get custody. So it doesn't remove the acrimony by any stretch of the imagination. It just shifts it to custody of the children. That's what's happened in Canada.
Right, and in Britain we actually talk about access rather than custody, because the idea is not that you own the children, it's that you actually want to be able to see the children and spend time with them, and I think that's really important. But fault-based divorce is something that increases the chances of couples having a bad divorce, right? That's the problem, is it sets people against each other from the start. They have to go into court and contest that the other person has done something wrong, which is not a great base on which to start then an argument about what you're going to settle.
You think people should be encouraged to divorce even if no one's done anything wrong?
No, I think that having to prove that in a court of law is not something that is going to lead you to a better arbitration about settling money and settling access to children. I think that's the point. You have a ridiculous situation where couples who say, well, actually, we've just grown apart, nonetheless, unless they want to wait 5 years or 2 years for separation, they have to go in and plead unreasonable behaviour to get a divorce and start splitting up their assets. that's the joy of no-fault divorce, is that you don't have to make those contested cases. You can simply say, our marriage is no longer working, and part ways without going into all of that acrimony. That seems quite sensible to me.
It also seems quite naive to me.
Well,
I've seen very few non-acrimonious divorces. They're very hard on kids. So I don't think anything that makes them easier is a very good idea. It might be good in the short term, but it's not good in the long term. Unless you don't think that marriage is a useful institution. And if you think that it's part of the patriarchal tyranny, then you might think that as well. So, but it's a very useful institution, mostly for kids. So
I agree that I'm married. Modern marriage has a lot to recommend it. I do also think it is a patriarchal institution. It is literally...
Of course you think that.
Well,
because you think virtually everything that occurs in our society is a patriarchal institution. And it's easy to think that because then you only have to think one thing. You have a one-thing answer for everything.
You could let
it's part of the patriarchal institution.
I don't think you're obeying the rule that says maybe treat people as if they have something worth hearing. So
I'm not making a case for the patriarchal tyranny. And I don't think you are either. I think that you're making a case that's like a universally cliched case for the patriarchal tyranny. I don't see too much of you reflected in your articles at all.
Why do women change their names on marriage traditionally?
I don't know exactly. Why do you think they do?
Because it was to symbolize the transfer of their ownership from one family to another family. That's why in The Handmaid's Tale you have off Warren, off Glenn.
Oh God, Margaret Atwood. Well, she was just about devoured by the feminists last year, so that was something interesting to observe.
I think she made a very good point. She wasn't devoured by all feminists. I'm a feminist. I thought what she said about due process in cases like that is perfectly reasonable.
Well, many people didn't.
No, but then, guess what? This is on the internet. You can find someone who disagrees with pretty much anything. But so why do you think women change their names when they get married traditionally? If it's not about transfer of property ownership traditionally?
I don't know if I have an opinion about that. The specific reasons for that, I'd have to look into it for a fair amount of time before I decided it, but I certainly wouldn't boil it down to a unidimensional argument about the ownership of women by men. So,
okay.
I mean, the part of the problem too is with this sort of discussion is that it's, and this is why I consider it a manifestation of ideological possession. It's predictable.
Well, that's what
knowing your stance on.
But having a coherent ideology does mean that it is predictable, because
you don't need an ideology.
It is one logical thing that flows from another, and all those pieces tessellate together. So what I find very interesting about your thinking, I find it quite slightly baffling, is that I don't really see how all the pieces fit together. You say that you're not, you believe in God, but there's a lot of emphasis about going back to...
No, I actually say I act as if God exists.
Right. But,
which is actually my definition of belief.
Okay, but that then doesn't, to me, tessellate very obviously with your insistence that actually it's just about pure science, and there's not a because I can
what insistence that it's just about pure science?
Well,
I wrote Maps of Meaning. There's no insistence in that it's just about pure science.
Okay, but you make appeals to science. You make appeals to science all the time. You say, well, this is what the literature says, and the trouble with God is that ultimately you can't say this is what the literature says. There is no literature.
Which is why I don't say anything about the scientific status of God, apart from what can be experienced maybe under certain conditions of what would you call chemical-induced mysticism, which seems to be something that you can say something scientifically about. But I see that there's two different realms, right? There's a realm of values and a realm of facts, and in the realm of facts, science reigns supreme. But it doesn't in the realm of values. You have to look elsewhere. That was what the humanities were for, before they got, what would you say, hijacked by ideologues. And the idea that something should be consistent. You were talking about the necessity for consistency in ideology. It's like, I'm not hearing what you think. I'm hearing how you're able to represent the ideology you were taught. And it's not that interesting, because I don't know anything about you. I could replace you with someone else who thinks the same way. And that means you're not here. That's what it means. It's not pleasant. So you're not integrating the specifics of your personal experience with what you've been taught to synthesize something that's genuine and surprising and engaging in a narrative sense as a consequence. And that's the pathology of ideological possession. It's not good. And it's not good that I know where you stand on things. Once I know a few things, it's like, why have a conversation? I already know where you stand on things.
I bet you don't know where I stand on all things.
I would hope that was true.
Okay, let's talk about transgender issues. That's fun. What do you think I think about transgender issues?
I suspect that you think that gender expression, gender identity are fundamentally social constructs, but I could be wrong.
No, I believe that there are definitely some biological differences between the sexes. We've observed them. I do believe that gender is a hugely powerful social structure that we've built on top of that it is largely, but not entirely, socially constructed. I think when you look back through the history, you know, biological differences have consistently shrunk. Like we were talking in the 18th...
They haven't in Scandinavia, they've magnified.
Okay, but we were talking in the 18th...
That's actually an important exception, because Scandinavia has gone farther than any other area, the Scandinavian countries, in establishing egalitarian social policy. And the differences in interest and career choice and personality between men and women have grown as a consequence, not shrunk, which is exactly the opposite of what the social constructionists predicted.
But also just suggests that they're malleable, actually, rather than fixed.
Well, of course they're malleable. No one would ever suggest otherwise.
Right. So that's what I mean. So I think
they're not malleable in the direction that the social constructionists presumed. As you flatten out the sociological landscape, you maximize the biological differences. No one saw that coming. And you might think, well, it's a handful of right-wing scientists who are pushing that. It's like, no, it's not. It's mainstream psychology, and there aren't any radical right-wingers in mainstream psychology. And everyone who discovered that was absolutely shocked by it. And these papers have been cited by thousands of people, and they have tens of thousands of subjects, and they've been done on virtually national level samples, cross-culturally.
But I also think the behaviour in Scandinavia has changed. For example, a lot more men take paternity leave now, that there is a portion that is reserved purely for men. That doesn't seem to be making them wildly unhappy. So I think that there are definitely behavioural things that are susceptible to nudges by society, by government and by the state, and that do change the way that people behave.
Yeah, that seems
so we can kind
plausible.
Of meet in the middle on that one.
We know that people can be educated and that we can develop as a consequence of learning. That's certainly not a disputable proposition.
And I also believe that there is no evidence for gender identity in the way that it is used as an idea of a soul. I think that that's the way that it's often used to me.
By who?
By transgender activists.
Yes, well,
I think it's all about having a female soul, and that to me seems strange. I don't see how you can...
something like biological determinism.
Right.
Which is very... It's one of the things that's so perversely amusing about these sorts of arguments is that, well, but I attribute it to the lack of demand for logical consistency as a consequence of postmodern thinking. You can believe one thing when it's convenient in one situation and another thing when it's convenient for another. So we're in the perverse position where if you're a man born in a woman's body, that's biologically determined. But if you're a woman born in a woman's body, that's socially constructed. It's like, okay, good luck with that theory.
Right. I don't believe you can be a man born in a woman's body or a woman born in a man's body. What I believe is that there are some people who feel alienation towards their bodies and they want to remove body
Well, everybody
parts.
feels that.
Right, but they feel it to such an extent that clinically the best treatment for them is to transition and live as if they were the other sex.
Yeah, well, I don't think that there's any evidence that that's clinically the best treatment. We certainly don't know enough to make that presupposition, and I think we're playing with fire assuming that that's the case. The long-term outcome studies certainly don't demonstrate that. So it's not so.
I would make a very big distinction there between adults and between children. I think
would be a good distinction to make.
Right,
yeah.
But I think we are very quick to diagnose and treat children in a way that I find, and not waiting for the research, and that I find concerning.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, well, the lawsuits will put an end to that in about 15 years.
So there's one place that we have found from which that is something that gets me a lot of hate, right?
I'm sure it does.
I'm a turf and a bigot for that. So
right.
I don't think that's something that you would have been able to predict, that I think, because that is not now the orthodox feminist position.
I agree completely.
Oh, isn't that good?
So congratulations.
We've all learned something. I just wanted to talk quickly about Me Too movement. Tell me your reaction to what's unfolded over the last year. I won't put words in your mouth. You tell me.
Well, there's certainly no shortage of evidence for reprehensible sexual behavior on the part of people who can use power to get away with it. So that's not so good. The Me Too movement, I suspect it probably did some good things and some terrible things. So I would say that there's a dangerous proclivity to abandon the concept of the presumption of innocence. So in university campuses, for example, we're moving towards a preponderance of evidence model. I'm not very happy with that model. I think that's a very big mistake. The presumption of innocence is nothing short of a miracle, and we abandon it at our extreme peril. So I'm not happy with that. I think the believe the victim idea is something that only a fool could conjure up, because it opens the door to unbelievable opportunity for manipulation.
I think that I would disagree with you slightly on that, because I think what that means is what people are arguing for is don't instantly dismiss or disbelieve the victim, right? Which is a very different.
No, that's partly what they're arguing for. There's
thing.
Plenty of people who are arguing for the fundamental attitude to be believe the victim. So some people are arguing to not automatically disbelieve the victim, which is a perfectly reasonable thing to argue for, but that isn't where it ends. So
okay, climate change. I saw you posting a link to a study suggesting that a lot of the way that it's talked about has been overhyped. What are your beliefs about climate change?
Well, I spent a lot of time. I don't really have beliefs about climate change, I wouldn't say. I mean, I think the climate is probably warming, but it's been warming since the last ice age, so I don't know. But
it's
exactly
dramatically accelerated even in the last couple of decades.
Yeah, maybe. Mm-hmm. And possibly. It's not so obvious. I spent quite a bit of time going through the relevant literature. I read about 200 books on ecological, what would you call it, on ecology and economy when I worked for the UN for about a 2-year period, and it's not so obvious what's happening, just like with any complex system. The problem I have fundamentally isn't really a climate change issue. It's that I find it very difficult to distinguish valid environmental claims from environmental claims that are made as a, what would you call it, secondary anti-capitalist front, essentially. So it's so politicized that it's very difficult to parse out the data from the politicization.
So I saw there was a line in 12 Rules which says people stricken with poverty don't care about carbon dioxide.
Yeah, that's definitely the case.
And I think that's not an unreasonable point to make, because you think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? People, if you can't eat, then actually you can't really worry about what's happening in 50 years to the planet. However, I don't think that's a reason not to tackle climate change, because those same people in the global south...
It's partly a reason.
Is it though? Because people in the global south...
coal-generated plants stop people from starving. So yes, it's partly a reason. And it's certainly the case that making energy more expensive, obviously, makes things more difficult for poor people. So yes, it's definitely an issue. And I would say, it's kind of a conundrum for those on the left. It's like, what's it going to be? Clean air or hungry people? Think, well, we don't have to choose. It's like, okay.
Or renewable energy, or...
good luck with that.
Or nuclear power. I'd be fine with more nuclear power stations.
Yeah, well, it doesn't look like we're moving in that direction very fast.
No, but that is a solution.
Well, it worked for the French.
I was fascinated. David Attenborough is something kind of close to a national religion in Britain. So there's a bit where you say population control advocates like him, you compare them to Eric Harris, one of the Columbine killers. Why then is it virtuous to propose that the planet might be better off if there were fewer people on it? And I found that completely boggling, that you have elided their population control through people not being born and the mass slaughter of people who are already alive.
It's the motivation that I question.
Right. Tell me more about that.
Well, what kind of statement is the planet would be better off with fewer people on it? First of all, there's an easy solution to that. You could leave.
Unfortunately, much the best efforts of Elon Musk, that is not yet an option permanently. Or do you
no, that isn't
suicide?
What I mean. That's what I meant, yes. If you're very concerned about your carbon footprint, there's a very fast solution to that. So, and I think it's disingenuous to, well, it's the other people, or maybe it's the people who haven't been born yet. It's like, this is also the problem I have with much of the environmentalist movement, is there's a powerful stream of anti-human sentiment that motivates it, and masquerading under the guise of virtue on a planetary scale. It's like, could be. I mean, it's not like we're not fouling our own nest, But
that's why I'm fascinated by where you come from, is because the book, is so much about things being in balance and harmony, right? And order and chaos outweigh each other. Well, what overpopulation has done is got to the same.
Who says we have overpopulation?
Well, I think that it's very difficult to see under the current model of fossil fuel-based capitalism. Sorry to use that word. I know it upsets you.
But that is what you
when we run out of fossil fuels.
Yeah, that's not going to happen.
Well, it will happen.
Yeah.
Because there is
people have been saying that's going to happen for 50 years, and now the United States is a net exporter of fossil fuel.
Right.
And so no one saw that coming, did they? But it happened.
And you're right, that might be the case, but at the moment I would say that, you know, China is putting up new coal-fired power stations, you know, by the bucket load.
Yeah.
It is entirely possible that the stuff that the developed nations did, that now developing nations did, you know, and now doing to make themselves
they'll
richer.
get concerned about clean air when they get richer. That's what the data indicate. Once you get GDP up to about $5,000 per year, people start to become concerned with environmental issues. So if we make people rich fast enough, I don't think so. It'll happen too late for some things. It looks like we're going to top out at about 9 billion. I think we can handle that. I think probably one of the problems that'll beset us in 100 years, assuming there are even creatures like us around in 100 years, is that there'll be too few people, not too many. You know, the projections top out at about 9 billion. It's only 2 billion more than we have now. There's every reason to assume that we can cope with that, especially given the rapid decreases in poverty around the world at the moment. There's a bit of a bottleneck. There'll probably be some more extinction. What we're doing to the oceans by overfishing doesn't seem very smart, but we've only been aware of our role as planetary stewards since 1960, I would say, and we're not doing too bad for people who just woke up to the fact that we're actually a planetary force. And I don't think that we're overpopulated. I think all the arguments that all the people who made those arguments in the 1960s, like Paul Ehrlich, I think he wrote The Population Bomb, predicted mass starvation by the year 2000. He was absolutely and completely wrong.
No, we've been very lucky with things like golden rice, for example, and genetic engineering of crops. I think that's...
Yeah, it's not luck.
No, it is. I agree. There, you know, human ingenuity is a huge part of that, definitely.
Right. Well, and more people, you know, more ingenuity. You know, and Bjorn Lomborg, who I really admire, this skeptical environmentalist who's actually gone a very long ways to trying to figure out what we could do at a planetary level that would actually be useful and productive. His research has indicated the best possible investment isn't carbon tax, it isn't cessation of utilization of carbon-based fuel. It's probably investment in early infant care around the world, especially in developing countries. Seems right to me. He's done the analysis very carefully.
One more area that you've talked about that's caused controversy is gay parenting. You said the devil is in the detail and you want to see more studies on that. What do you think might be the adverse effects of having same-sex parents?
Well, I don't think we know what modeling is optimal for children. That's really the issue. I mean, I suspect that 2 parents are better than 1. Suspect, right? I don't know. 1 parent is definitely worse than 2. We know that. But we don't know what exposure to role models, say, is necessary for the continuity of maternal behavior or for the adoption of functional gender roles. We don't know any of that. And so that's the variable. Obviously, you know, no one knows what the consequence of being raised with 2 people of the same sex is. Maybe none.
Right. So there doesn't seem to be any evidence so far. That's all the literature review suggests that there were a couple that showed problems, but they were in coupledoms that had already broken down. Right. So there is no evidence. Maybe there will be some found, but at the moment there is no evidence that there is any problem with having gay parents.
I never said there was. Somebody asked me, I believe it was a question like, if there was a problem, what would it be? It's something like that. No, I mean, you can make a very strong conservative case for gay marriage, I think. I mean, not that I would necessarily be motivated to make a conservative argument.
David Cameron, our former Prime Minister, said, I support gay marriage because I'm a conservative.
Yes, right. So, you know, it's obviously homosexuality is... It's been around forever. Well, so what's the appropriate social response to that? Well, conceivably, bringing as many people as possible into something approximating the same game. I think you could make a reasonable case for that. What's the consequence of that for children in those families? I don't know. I mean, what I would say is, well, the obvious risk is that there's no one of the opposite sex around. I mean, it doesn't take a... What would you get? It doesn't take the perception of genius to come up with the observation that that might be a problem. Now, maybe it's not. And my suspicions are there's probably far more relevant problems with regards to what happens to children that isn't good than that.
Right. So this is a way in which, that is now a conservative position to hold. I think it's 20 years ago that would have been anathema to mainstream conservatives.
Well, people were concerned with the deterioration of marriage and believed that any additional transformations would further weaken it. And I think that that's not an unreasonable position given how weak it's become. And I don't think that that's been good for people overall.
Okay, let's talk about free speech to finish on. You write in your book about Nietzsche, who became the Nazis' favourite intellectual, and you also talk about a professor...
Only through his sister's mistranslations of his work.
Right, but you talk a little bit as well about another professor whose ideas you thought led inevitably to kind of Maoism, and you said, I don't know how he can't be more worried about where his ideas lead. Do you worry about where where your work might be taken and used by other people? I saw you posing with...
I worry about that all the time.
With a Pepe flag.
Oh, I can't believe you brought that up.
Right, but I just think it's...
Seriously, I can't believe you brought that up. You should go online.
Yeah, I do.
There's a...
Believe me, I do.
There's a video called, I think it's called, Is Jordan Peterson a Darling of the Alt-Right? Have you watched the video of the person who put up that Pepe flag with me? He's online.
But
Go watch it.
I have seen... You wouldn't, I would say...
And why are you concerned about Pepe anyways? Jesus, he disappeared like 3 years ago.
It is...
And most of that was trolling by young guys who were trying to drag the media into idiot accusations like the idea that this was a white supremacist gesture, which I was asked about on CBC. It's like, no, it wasn't. It was Fortran trolls playing the media for fools, which worked. And much of the Pepe thing was that as well.
Okay, but the problem with people ironically pretending to be Nazis on the internet...
They weren't pretending to be Nazis.
But no, this is a separate phenomenon, and 4chan definitely do ironically pretend to be all of the worst things they can possibly be, is that some people take that very seriously. There was a case in America recently of a guy who stabbed his father because he had thought that his father was a Democrat. He was writing stuff for a conservative website. He'd got very into the Pizzagate conspiracy theory.
He's probably paranoid.
Right, so there are people who take this stuff very, very seriously, and they latch onto it.
What's your point?
I'm saying that, how much responsibility do you feel that you have, particularly guys the alt-right, who, as you say, some of them have enjoyed your work, and say,
no,
I'm not one of you guys. I'm not with you guys.
They haven't enjoyed my work.
I've definitely read bits on the internet.
Read more.
Okay.
Find some evidence. I'm extraordinarily sick and tired of this particular accusation / line of questioning. I'm no fan of the identitarian right, the ethno-nationalists, the alt-right. First of all, what do you mean by alt-right exactly? Do you mean ethno-nationalists? Do you mean white supremacists?
No, I mean people who are on the right but have got their power base outside the traditional media. They see themselves as an alternative. So I see them coming up...
That's a pretty loose definition of the alt-right.
Rush Limbaugh kind of talk radio, right? People who see themselves in opposition to an establishment.
Rush Limbaugh is not the alt-right.
No,
he's been around for 30 years.
Right, so he's the progenitor of what I see now, Breitbart and things like that, are the new media version of that very old media
Well, let's
format.
define what constitutes alt-right first. For me, they're ethno-nationalists. They tend to be white supremacists. And generally, when people tar me with an alt-right epithet, the reason they're doing that is to associate me with those people. They don't like me. And the reason for that is that I've made it very clear, not only in my videos, but on Twitter, that I don't like them. I don't like their anti-Semitism. I don't like their use of identity politics. I don't agree with their aims. I think that their notion is something like, well, if everybody's going to play identity politics, we're going to play it too, and we're going to win. And I can certainly understand that motivation, but I think it's a bad game all around. And I think the only reason that I was ever associated in any sense whatsoever with anything to do with the alt-right was because it was extremely convenient of the radical leftists, who I fundamentally detest, to paint me as a representative of that viewpoint.
Right.
Other than that, zero. Now,
that's okay, but that's not what I did. You say so. At no point did I say you were.
Well, you brought up the whole Pepe thing.
But I did bring that up. But there was a reason I did that, which is that Nietzsche himself said, "I'm an anti-Semite," right? And yet his ideology and his philosophy ended up being used by the Nazis. So my question to you is, how much responsibility do you feel about the way in which
what I
your
feel.
work
It's
is
not
used?
how much responsibility I feel. It's how much responsibility I take.
Right.
Right. And I take as much responsibility as I possibly can. Right. Which is why I'm doing what I'm doing. Right. I'm going around the world. I'm talking in different cities. I'm talking to people as much as I can. I'm putting out content that I think is useful for people online. And I'm clarifying what I think. I have 300 videos on YouTube. virtually, for all intents and purposes, every single word I've said to students in a professional capacity since 1992. And despite the fact that I have innumerable, highly motivated enemies, they haven't been able to find one thing I've said in 30 years that, what would you say, justifies any of those accusations, or any other accusations for that matter. So it's quite the phenomena. I mean, I understand it to some degree, you know, because...
So, sorry, about the Pepe flag, 'cause you can help me explain this. Why did you pose with it? What were your reasons for doing it? Did people just come up and bring it to you and
Yeah, I was like posing with... I've probably been photographed with, I don't know, 5,000 people in the last 2 years. And, you know, it's one after the other, often in groups of 100, 150 or 200 people. And it's like 15 seconds.
Right.
And they brought this flag. One of them had spoken at the event. They were doing it ironically. They unfurled the flag and we took a picture, and that was that.
Would you have posed ironically with a hammer and sickle flag?
I don't know under the circumstances what I would have done. I have all sorts of Soviet art in my house.
Right. Because this is, I think, anybody could get caught out, and social embarrassment is a huge factor, and you don't want to kind of tell people who've been very nice to you that actually you don't want to do the thing. I just wonder if that's something that you regret now, that you wouldn't do it again if you had the opportunity.
Well, I don't think it did me any good. I don't think I'll betray my former self. We'll just leave it where it is. I made the decision that I made under the circumstances and took what was there into consideration. I think that the Pepe formulators did a wonderful job of trolling the standard media. I don't think that they were what everyone presumed them to be.
I think they did a wonderful job of trolling you as well, in a sense, right? Recruiting you and your image and your appeal to people to their kind of cause, which is ironic.
I don't really think so.
But is not actually. Underneath it all, I don't find it very ironic, actually.
What don't you find ironic?
That a lot of the kind of 4chan culture, which is saying, I'm just going to say the worst possible thing that I can say just to prove that I can say it because free speech is still alive. I think that in itself is quite poisonous to the discourse. I think I try and conduct myself online in a relatively civilized manner. I do not always succeed, but I do not think just going into a room and screaming epithets is something that I need to do on a daily basis to prove that free speech isn't dead, right?
I think we could probably agree that that's a reasonable
a rare note of consensus. But I have to come back to the free speech idea, because I think that whole idea of the intellectual dark web, and this came up a couple of times at your event on Thursday, is predicated on the idea that you have been marginalised for your opinions or oppressed for your opinions.
It's not predicated on my claim of that.
Right. It's predicated on...
Well, I don't know. I'm not claiming I've been marginalised. I would never use that word, first of all. That's for sure.
So, but the idea of a dark...
I don't feel oppressed.
Good. I'm pleased to hear it. But I do think that the way that you got the cheers from that crowd was very much about, there was an idea of taboo breaking, right? That oh, this is a microaggression, but I'm going to say it anyway, that, you know, hard work is the way to succeed. And I thought that was fascinating, because to me you don't look like somebody who has particularly suffered an outrageous amount for your opinions. People have certainly disagreed. They've been rude. They've in some cases.
The only reason I haven't suffered an outrageous amount for my opinions is because I've handled the consequence of their utterance exceptionally well. My job was at risk. My career was at risk. My family stability was at risk. So I wouldn't push that one too far.
In what way was your job at risk?
Jesus. Last year, 200 of my fellow faculty members signed a petition to get me fired. That was only one of a dozen things that happened. The university wrote me 2 letters, 2 cease and desist letters from their HR departments with their legal staff. 3 of those and you're done. They just fired Rick Maida in Canada at Acadia University for talking about many of the same things that I've talked about. So the fact that I've come through this relatively unscathed has very little to do with the vitriol of the attacks. There was plenty of motivation to take me out. It just didn't work.
Right. And I think the fact that it didn't work, to me, makes me ultimately optimistic about where we are, because
Why?
Because I went on, I did a panel a while ago with Zarganara, a Burmese comedian, who was imprisoned for making a joke, right? And we are not yet at that stage. I think, undoubtedly,
We're not. We're damn close.
Really?
How about the guy with the pug in the UK?
Count Dankula.
That's the one.
Right, but he did actually, I mean, that
was a joke. You
I
might not have liked it. I didn't say it was a good joke. I didn't say it was an appropriate joke. I didn't say any of that. I didn't say it was a well thought through joke. But it was a joke.
Yeah, I just fundamentally don't believe that it was a joke. I believe that it was camouflaged as a joke, and that's what it kind of comes across.
Right.
And
Well, that's exactly what you would believe if you were inclined to persecute comedians.
No, I'm not inclined to persecute someone.
Well, you're inclined to persecute him.
I don't think he's a comedian, and I don't think I would have to go and look at the circumstances of that case. But I think
he didn't like his girlfriend's pug and thought he would teach it to do something reprehensible as a joke.
Right, but I see you getting involved, say, tweeting Douglas Murray's article about Tommy Robinson, and I think you see that as a free speech issue, and that's not how I see Tommy Robinson's case at all. I see that as contempt of court, someone who endangered a grooming trial. How do you see that case?
I see it as very fortunate that Tommy Robinson didn't die in prison.
I think I would say that about a lot of people in prison. I think it's very hard to be in prison if you are a sex offender, for example. I think our British prisons are less inhumane than American prisons, but they are still brutal places to be. However, I do think that was an appropriate punishment for somebody who tried to collapse a grooming trial.
Well,
but are you? I guess are you a prison abolitionist?
No.
Oh, right, okay. So you do believe that some people, there are offences for which people need to go to prison?
Why would you ask me a question like that?
Well,
Do I look like someone who isn't interested in meting out appropriate punishment?
No, but I just thought maybe I've made an assumption about you. And I didn't want to make an assumption about you. I'm just going to end with a quick fire round. So I know that this is YouTube, so we have been able to talk for a really long time, but I just want quick answers from you. Who is your favourite author?
Dostoevsky.
Who's your favourite female author?
Margaret Lawrence, I think.
I don't know her.
She's a Canadian author. Kind of an antidote to Margaret Atwood, in my estimation.
Okay. When did you last cry?
Oh, God, who knows? Last week, probably.
Who is your smartest opponent?
Sam Harris is pretty smart.
Because you've had debates about atheism with him and about rationality. And
yeah, I don't really regard him exactly as an opponent. You know, I mean, we disagree on things. I don't really tend to think of people as opponents, generally. I mean, but Harris is smart. He's good at making his case, and so that's been interesting.
What big question don't you know the answer to?
What big question don't I know the answer to? Oh, God, that's a tough one. There's so many of them. Well, personally, it's what I should do in 2 years.
When did you last change your mind about something important?
I'm changing my mind about things all the time. Every time I do a lecture, I change my mind about something.
But something important, something big.
Oh, well, I can tell you. I mean, one thing I've learned in the last 2 years is that I think I overestimated. There's an obesity epidemic in North America, perhaps throughout the Western world. I think I overestimated the degree to which that was a consequence of a sedentary lifestyle, and overestimated the degree to which a lack of discipline was contributing to it. I think much more now that it's an illness.
Well, those are two different things, though, aren't they? Discipline is self-control, and illness is something out of your control.
Well, let's say you're overweight. You should exercise. It's like, well, actually, the evidence that exercise will thin you down isn't that great. And maybe the reason that you're not exercising is because you're ill, not that you're ill because you're not exercising. So I have a lot more sympathy for the hypothesis that the obesity epidemic is actually a consequence of a of an illness, of a broad scale. Illness isn't exactly right. It's a dietary problem, fundamentally. And there are deep causes for that.
Are you still eating your all beef diet?
Unfortunately, yes.
Really just beef? Not, can you have like ketchup on it?
Nothing. Right. Yes, it isn't something I would lightly recommend. It's a little hard on your social life. It makes traveling quite difficult, and it's dull as hell. But
what has it done for you?
Well, I lost 50 pounds in 7 months. I stopped snoring. I had some autoimmune conditions that seem to have gone away. I'm not taking antidepressants. My mood isn't perfectly regulated, but I'm under a fair bit of stress, so that might have something to do with it. I sleep much less. I can work more.
Imagine your arteries might not be in great shape.
I don't think there's any evidence that I don't think we have any idea what causes arteriosclerosis. I think all of the dietary knowledge we have is rubbish. And partly because it's unbelievably difficult to do proper dietary studies. You can't do controlled studies. It's all correlational, and there's so many variables. I think the correlational studies are useless. So also this all meat diet, this all beef diet has apparently cured my daughter. So,
who had juvenile rheumatoid arthritis?
Well, that was the original diagnosis. Then it was idiopathic, which means we don't know what the hell is causing it. Yeah, but she's completely symptom-free. So that sort of thing makes you sit up and take notice, because it doesn't make any sense.
When was the last time you lied? Because the book says no lying. Do you still lie?
Everybody lies.
As Dr. House himself told us. What is most important?
But I'm pretty damn careful about it.
What is most important to you in life?
Not being stupid.
How would your life...
Not making foolish mistakes. Not being incautious. Yeah.
That's tough on yourself.
Life's tough, man.
Right. How would your life have been different if you'd been born female?
Multiple orgasms.
It's not a bad one. What's your biggest regret?